I would like to ask the Treasury Minister whether having members of the Board of the Financial Services Authority who serve as board members of licence holders represent a conflict of interest.
From the Treasury Minister, Mr Cannon, to reply.
Mr President, it is important that the board members of the Isle of Man Financial Services Authority have the necessary knowledge and experience of the financial services industry to allow them to suitably discharge their duties. In order to attain the relevant knowledge and experience, it is possible that through their employment history, existing roles or other associations, board members have private interests which could result in a potential conflict of interest in matters to be considered or determined by the authority. These may include being a director of a licence holder or regulated entity or regulated designated business. It is important to note, Mr President, that the authority takes a number of steps to ensure that members' conflicts are suitably handled. These include the interests that members disclose being recorded in a register which can be accessed by the Secretary to the Board of the Authority, all authority members, senior staff within the executive of the authority's auditors, members of Tynwald and the Council of Ministers. Also, prior to any meetings of the Board of the Authority and its committees, the agenda is reviewed by the Secretary to the Board to identify any potential conflicts for members based on the Register of Interests. Where a conflict arises, the members concerned will not be given the paper or information relating to the agenda item involved and will not participate in any related discussion or decisions. And at the beginning of each board meeting, an agenda item is included to allow any potential conflicts not already identified to be disclosed. Where a potential conflict is identified, the affected members will be asked to leave the meeting when the relevant topic is being discussed and determined. The authority is currently in the process of finalising a new code of conduct for its members, and this will set out in more detail how potential conflicts are managed. This code, I am assured, will be available in due course on the authority's website.
Supplementary question, Mr Hooper.
Thank you, Mr President. Back in 2011, there was a select committee report into the Cowthing incident. One of the recommendations included in that report was there should not be any ability for individuals to be directors of banks if they are appointed as an FSC commissioner, and vice versa. So my understanding of the reason for this recommendation is concerns around potential conflicts. So the question to the Minister is he satisfied with the current measures that are in place to address potential conflicts, or does he agree with me that this recommendation should be reconsidered?
Mr Cannon.
Thank you, Mr President. I will have to go back and have a look at that specific recommendation relating to that report. But in terms of the operation of the FSA at the moment, the measures that it has in place to identify conflicts of interest and the measures that it is taking to identify those conflicts of interest before matters are both discussed and decided. I am satisfied that the authority is taking the proper steps. Clearly, there has been some changes to the authority recently, including a merger of the IPA and what was the Financial Services Commission. There are some overlap in terms of resolving some conflicts of interest that existed, and clearly the important thing is now that this matter becomes more transparent, and I look forward to the FSA publishing these details in full on its website so that they're fully accessible and understood by members of the public.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
Thank you. In an effort to be helpful to the Treasury Minister, a copy of the recommendations of the committee have just been put on his desk so that he can have a quick look at them. But the result, as the chairman of that committee on Kepling, Singer and Friedlander, one of the things that came through quite strongly was that it undermined the credibility of the regulator to have people who were both directors of regulated entities and then sitting in judgment regulating the industry itself. That was something that the committee felt was quite seriously detrimental to the Isle of Man in its reputation. Would the Treasury Minister not actually consider that you cannot be both poacher and gamekeeper at the same time?
Treasury Minister.
Yes, I mean, absolutely, I hear exactly what the honourable members are saying to me, and I recognise the recommendations from the Cowthing issue, which in itself was a very serious issue. I think where the balance needs to be struck, of course, is having people who have some understanding of the needs for business or evolving needs of the industry. I think my answer to the members, I am completely satisfied at the moment that this recommendation is not materially being impacted by the current directorship of the board. And I think the answer to the question is that I will emphasise this matter back to the FSA, discuss this with the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Executive of the FSA, and ensure that we are keeping to the principles of this recommendation and are materially ensuring its integrity as we progress forward with the directorship appointments to the board.
Honourable Member for Douglas East, Mr. Robert Shaw.
Thank you, Mr. President. And the previous questioners have to some extent covered the point I wanted to make with regard to the exchanges in this honourable court in 2011, when it was emphasised very clearly that there was, from the external sense of this, the perception of reputational damage being a matter of concern. And in light of the Treasury Minister's comments, could he absolutely reassure us that he will personally satisfy himself that everything currently being done will ensure that we avoid reputational damage perception in the future?
Cannon.
Mr. President, I accept the point that is being raised. Absolutely, it's imperative that the FSA conducts its business with integrity, and we have absolute confidence that the directors of the Financial Services Authority are not materially conflicted in such a way so as to cause questions or call into doubt their decision-making if such an unfortunate situation should occur where the FSA or the island's reputation is called into the question.
Member for Douglas South, Mrs. Beecroft.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Minister just said where they're materially affected. Does the Minister agree with me that actually conflict of interest covers perception as well as actual material interest? And is that perception that can be very, very damaging to the island? And also, is it not a slight contradiction when he says that we need board members who are currently in the industry because they have an understanding of what the industry needs, and yet when something is on the agenda that would affect that, they have to take no part. So you're not benefiting from their experience when it comes to the crunch because they have to leave because they've got a conflict of interest. It just seems slightly it doesn't sit quite right, that logic, it doesn't stack up with me. So I'd like a bit more explanation on that one. Thank you.
Treasury Minister.
Well, I think I might helpfully turn to the Select Committee's recommendations, which do determine that at the time in 2011 that the Treasury should restructure the oversight model to create separate commissioners' boards in one organisation, but that the pool of suitably talented and qualified individuals to oversee the banks to be drawn from other parts of the financial services sector, and for the commissioners of the FSC at the time overseeing banks to be able to hold directorships of trust funds and corporate services businesses, but they would be barred from being a director of a bank in the Isle of Man. I think the point is that the committee at the time did recognise the value of having individuals in there who had financial services experience and clearly sought to ensure that that financial services experience didn't necessarily pertain directly to the organisation or organisations that reflected that experience, particularly banks, I would suggest, which is the key probe of the question here. And therefore, honourable members, I am satisfied that the current diversity of the board is such that this type of happening or question mark that occurred around the time of the Kelp thing and Singer and Friedlander collapse are unlikely to occur again, and more so because, as I suggest to honourable members, the merging of both the IPA and what was the FSC into the FSA has actually created a more diverse organisation and vis-a-vis less opportunity for it to perhaps become too focused on one particular sector without a broader regulatory governance environment around that.
Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Mr. President. I've recently been able to acquire from the FSA a copy of the board members' register of interests, and I'm not entirely sure that it does particularly give the distance that maybe the Treasury Minister hopes for, but I do welcome his comments that he concurs with the spirits of the recommendation moving away from active directors. The Minister then raised the issue of a code of conduct or code of governance from the FSA which will clarify these issues. Is it the Minister's intention to bring that to Tynwald? And if not, what sort of guarantees can we expect to make sure that the code will ensure that there is no one who is, say, both acting on both sides of the fence as poacher and gamekeeper?
Reply, sir.
Well, I'm not sure that it's appropriate to bring a document like that to Tynwald in terms of presentation for debate, but I will certainly ensure that that documentation, as is the case with much documentation that comes out from the FSA, is appropriately laid before Tynwald so that they can have, honourable members can have sight of it. And clearly, I must emphasise, Treasury is determined that the FSA conducts itself with integrity and that the appropriate directors are both put in place with experience of their relative industries to be able to make a contribution, and such that any such conflicts of interest are appropriately identified. Mr. President, I suggest I would take on board some of the comments this morning from honourable members and seek to ensure in my future discussions with the Chief Financial Officer and the Chief Executive of the FSA that we seek to ensure and confirm that we are adhering to the principles outlined by the Select Committee in 2011.